Welcome to another episode of the 90s and Noughties UK podcast, and it's the first episode of 2022. I'm joined by Tim, who is a podcast regular, and today, after hearing one of my previous episodes where I said I'd love to do an episode focusing on 2005, Tim said, yeah, go on then, let's do that, because 2005 was a bit of an odd year musically, because you had kind of the last of the novelty scene, and there were lots of kind of holdovers from the early 2000s, late 90s, that sort of time, and we were going into a more sort of progressive rock and, you know, a more rocky indie thing. I'm thinking things like the Arctic Monkeys. Welcome to the podcast, Tim. What we shall do is I'm going to read out the number ones from this year just to emphasize and give us a starting point to this conversation. So the list is as follows. So from January 2005, we had Against All Odds, Steve Brookstein, Jailhouse Rock, Elvis Presley. We'll explain these in a moment. One Night, I Got Stung, Elvis Presley. Goodies by Sierra, featuring P.T. Pablo. It's Now or Never, Elvis Presley. Like Toy Soldiers, Eminem. Sometimes You Can't Make It on Your Own, U2. Get Right, Jennifer Lopez. Over and Over, Nelly featuring Tim McGraw. Dakota by Stereophonics. All About You, You've Got a Friend, McFly. Is This the Way to Amarillo, Tony Christie featuring Peter Kay, Not Really. Lonely by Akon, Lila, Oasis. Axel F, Crazy Frog. Ghetto Gospel, Tupac featuring Elton John. You're Beautiful, James Blunt. I'll Be Okay, McFly. The Importance of Being Idle, Oasis. Dare, Gorillaz. Don't Ya, Pussycat Dolls featuring Busta Rhymes. Push the Button by Sugar Babes. I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor by the aforementioned Arctic Monkeys. You Raise Me Up, Westlife. Hung Up, Madonna. Stick With You by Pussycat Dolls. JCB Song, Nizlopi. And the year of 2005 ended with the X Factor winner, same as the start actually, That's My Goal by Shane Ward. Just to start us, Tim, what are your comments on those songs? It really does show a picture, doesn't it?
Well, very eclectic. Compare it to 15 years later, or so now. For me, 2005 is that era which I would like to define as the end of history. It is that era where indie rock was popular. It was getting number ones in the charts. Like Arctic Monkeys came from completely nowhere. Apparently, Alex Turner, he was working a part-time job, and then suddenly I was seeing his band there was no music video. It was just them performing in a hall with a poor camera. And they looked very young, and then they were on Top of the Pops. This is when it was interesting enough that about 2005, we're coming to the end of history because we're coming towards the end of Top of the Pops, when it has been moved onto Sundays on BBC Two before Malcolm in the Middle, and it is now doing that thing where they're doing guest presenters and showing bits of old Top of Pops. So we're going to a video from the 80s or 90s, say, oh, they're having fun. And it was just like a shock to see that. So a lot of indie there. Oasis was still knocking about. They hadn't split up until 2009, when they declined to go on stage at the V Festival and had to have an act stand in for them in 2009. It was probably their last greatest stuff. I quite like some of the stuff from Oasis. Well, I really like Oasis anyway. I love Definitely Maybe, and probably my favourite album is What's the Story, Morning Glory. I have a soft spot for other albums definitely the post Britpop era, or towards the death of Britpop in 97. We had Be Here Now, and I quite liked Heathen Chemistry, which is 3 years before we were talking about that. Importance of Being Idle is a pretty good song. They were still quite around at the time, because remember there was a Sky Sports advert promoting the 2005-06 football season, and they had them performing at what's now called the Etihad Stadium, the home of their football team that they support, Man City, and they were performing Meaning of Soul. And also going back to football, they were on FIFA as well. And a lot of there's quite a few FIFA soundtracks of that year, which were going to be on FIFA 06, which was the official sort of game for the 2005-06 football season. There was a lot of indie bands on there. There was the Doves on there, and I'm trying to think of some others, but indie rock for me, when I think of 2005, I always say it was a fantastic year of music. 2005 and later on 2006, for me, were fantastic years of music because there was a lot of good indie rock. There might be a bit, some people say, oh, was too much of it in the noughties, hence we got like indie landfill, but I just say it was a bit of a fantastic year, but we had a bit of everything. And just some of the bands we talked about, like I just mentioned Doves, and we've been talking about Oasis. Some of these bands, Dove's first album was in the year 2000. So we had and also away from indie rock back into sort of pop, the Sugar Babes. I don't know who was in the band by then because of the way the dynamics of the Sugar Babes are, that they had three completely different members by 2009-10. But we had sort of them who were still knocking around after quite a bit of success from 2000 to 2002. And they were getting number ones on loads of Now albums and stuff like that. And if you look at the Now albums there, I was looking at the last Now album, which came out in the autumn of 2005. And there was songs like from Kaiser Chiefs and other sort of those indie bands. So basically indie music and rock music was definitely pop music. And it was rubbing shoulders with the likes of Pussycat Dolls and Nelly and obviously 50 Cent, which is not too different to what Oasis and Blur were doing alongside Mariah Carey or Take That in 10 years earlier, which is definitely not the case now. Like you don't have, there are indie bands around there, the likes of Catfish and the Bottlemen and Blossoms, but they're not rubbing shoulders in the chart with Mabel or Clean Bandit or Jax Jones. They're sort of, the charts now, if you look at it now, it is mainly dance, R&B, and hip hop rap sort of stuff. Whereas back then you had everything. And also talk about the end of history. What was quite a lot of the songs, there were a lot of number ones and a lot of songs which were quite popular in the 80s, 90s, and even maybe further back into the 70s. There were lots of novelty tracks as well. So we had obviously Crazy Frog, and we had a lot of the comic relief songs were still quite present. And there was a lot of comic relief songs being at number ones in the 90s. For example, Boyzone with Going Gets Tough. And obviously 4 years earlier from our time frame we're talking about, we had Westlife and Gareth Gates before that. So a lot of these charity songs were quite popular. They were, because people still had to buy things. Interesting things about the dynamics of the noughties in terms of music, especially the mid-noughties. The iPod came out in 2003, and it became, by 2004, it was the must-have gadget of the time. But if you didn't have that, you would have had a MP3 player. So I had something like a stick. I had the pen drive one, but I also had this like MP3 player where you'd have to plug in and attach it by a USB cable. But we didn't download our music in 2005 and 6. We went out to shops, wherever they have the CDs, we'd go and buy the CDs, mainly from HMV. It was exactly similar as like with movies as well. With all the movies, you'd buy the DVD because this is before Netflix. This is before Spotify. Even though you had the iPod and people going to like iTunes or download it from so many different websites. There was so many of them around 2004-05. But we'd buy the CDs, and instead of like just downloading it, not everyone would download, oh, I heard I Predict Right on the radio. Oh, I'm just going to download it. I went out to the IVC. I would have gone out and bought the CD from either Tesco's or HMV, which I think was still a good thing because people would just hear Every Day I Love You less and less and I Predict Right by said band. But I feel like for me, I feel like they're missing out on that because they listen to the whole album. They get songs such as You Can Have It All, which was a bit different to what you heard on the radio with the Kaiser Chiefs. But for me, that was my favourite song from the album, probably my favourite song from the Kaiser Chiefs. It's just so good in a way. But also another thing comes to mind, Axel F and Crazy Frog. That wasn't just for novelty, but also I feel this was the infancy of the 80s revival, which really boomed in the 10s and is still pretty popular today if you listen to some sort of pop acts and all that. That there was a lot of songs which sampled a lot of 80s songs. Obviously, the first number one in the 2005 was a cover of a song from 1983. And there was a lot of songs, a lot of the dance music. I remember there was Milo, In Your Arms, Baby, which sampled Kim Cairns and Waiting for a Star to Fall by Boy Meets Girl, which also was remixed in another dance track, but with the actual lyrics instead of just In My Arms, Baby, yeah. So there was a lot of sort of, I felt like it was the start of the 80s revival. It was the last few years of music being a bit of a broad church, being eclectic, especially if you listen to Radio 1. Everything was being played on there and all that. So it was sort of like that sort of end of history. The novelty songs were still there. We did have Chico Time in 2006, but also we're seeing the novelty songs and the indie rock and the alternative rock and the rock. But also we're seeing from the more modern side, if you go in the last 15 years, X Factor is really taking control, and it really had a strong influence on music 5 or 6 years later. You just look at the successes of Little Mix and One Direction. This was before its peak, but it was still in a very strong position. So you're mixing sort of two eras. You're mixing what we knew from I would say, the 80s, 90s and the noughties with the novelties and the various of genres. And then you're now getting into sort of the X Factors. And obviously a lot of R&B is still very popular now and dance music. So it's sort of like the sort of happy medium between both eras in a way. It was quite interesting. There was so many number ones. And I was surprised I never understood why Elvis was so popular. I don't know if that was down to the iPod or something.
Now, I did look this up. I think there was an anniversary. I want to say he was born in 1935. And it was the 70th anniversary of his birth. And so the record company or the estate or somebody decided to release his singles between January and May of that year, which is why he's at number one 3 times. He's also got a number 2 as well. That's why you've got that. And in some ways, it was only like a year or 2 later when they made downloads kind of count towards the chart. I want to say that Gnarls Barkley Crazy was the first one to kind of get to number 1 off the basis of that. And I am really surprised. I know it happens every Christmas where Christmas songs go into the top 10 or whatever, but I'm really surprised that more things like Elvis haven't made it into the chart on a more regular basis, especially with the advent of streaming and that counting towards the chart. But yeah, that was sort of from a time when they were capitalizing on a specific moment. It's an anniversary, and of course, with me being the fan of a 70s rock band, Status Quo, a lot of people who love Elvis Presley and collect everything Presley would have bought that. And so they would have been attracting a completely different market. I mean, the other example in that number ones list is This the Way to Amarillo by Tony Christie, which is a song from 1971-72. And really, it's the music video. It was almost like the music video helped sell this really old song to, and that music video was amazing because it appealed to all ages, and it wasn't just about Ronnie Corbett falling off a treadmill, which was incredible. I lost count of the amount of times I have studied that video. It's a real tribute to British culture.
Oh yeah, with all the characters that they had in it. Some characters in it, I think we didn't know anything about events at the time. Maybe we look back on it and think, oh, that wouldn't be appropriate to show that sort of part of it. But it had like everything. It had like, I remember Sooty and Sweet being in it as well. And obviously Peter Kay was one of the biggest comedians in the UK at the time. And also, I remember that song was actually, I think it was on, I don't know if it was in the series, but it was on a DVD extra of Peter Kay's Phoenix Nights. And Max and Paddy sang that as well. So But it really sort of got into the popular psyche. And it was Tony Christie was on Christmas Top of Pops, and then he did his own version to tie in with the 2006 World Cup, with England's win the World Cup, and which was not that good at all.
No, it was really odd, and it was always weird when you heard him sing it live because you're used to hearing that 70s version, and it's kind of amazing that it beat the original release by some way in the chart. It didn't really do that well in this country originally, and it's just amazing how the power of the music video, and in some ways early internet and early YouTube would have pushed that forward. And it really annoyed me at the time because I thought, I remember it going to number one and being quite pleased that it did, because I was very much into like older music. And so it's like, yay, a piece of something I would enjoy is at number one. But the problem was everyone around you was enjoying it too. And you thought, but if I played this to you last week, you wouldn't have liked it. It's the new stuff that's come along. It's the music video and all the associations that have come with it, such as the attachment to Peter Kay. It annoyed me that Peter Kay, it said featuring Peter Kay, and it was like, he's not on it. He's in the music video.
I think we're talking the end of 2005, but I think we're dipping into the waters of 2006. Peter Kay did actually feature with a returning artist, this time a returning artist of a band who were very popular in the 1990s and sort of rediscovering themselves again with new albums and new music, but was with a song with Texas called Sleep, and he actually sang a little bit in it, and I always thought that was a great song as well, and that's got a good music video with Peter Kay in it as well. It got to it might have got to number 2 or charted in 2006, but it would have been recorded in 2005. So Madonna, she actually had a number one because she put out a new album, and she had Hung Up, but we were going back at sort of like the start of a throwback era. More so, we've been talking about that the 80s was getting sort of popular again. 80s nostalgia was starting to bubble over in the mid-noughties, especially with loads of samples and all that. Like later on, a year later, we'd have like the Bronski beat being sampled, 2 Bronski beat songs being sampled at the same time to make a dance track. But we had, even though it's not the 80s, it's the 70s, we had Gimme, Gimme, Gimme being sampled in for Hung Up, which got to number 1. It was quite a big hit throughout the autumn of 2005.
And that was the first ABBA song to be officially sampled.
Never knew that.
Yeah, I think it was the first one that they gave permission to sample. It'd probably been used before, but this was the first time proper, and I thought it was great because growing up, you always heard from your elders, oh, they just sample something and they rap all over it. And it's like, but Madonna has created a song that is, okay, it's not gimme, 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 but it's not, there was some merit there. It was a catchy song. It used that little piece from Gimme 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 that's very memorable and turned it into something else. And like you said earlier, there are a lot of songs in that period, things like Shine and Falling Stars, etc., which just used little elements and made something out of them that was fresh.
Oh yeah, but Madonna's an interesting artist because she for me, I think she did some fantastic stuff in the 90s, especially around 1998 with Frozen, The Power of Goodbye, and obviously Ray of Light. But she was still knocking it about in the noughties as well. She did a James Bond soundtrack, and she had number ones, quite a few number ones in the early noughties with Music, which featured Ali G in the music video, and obviously American Pie, which also was a cover. So she was sort of like, and obviously a few years later, she'll collab with Justin Timberlake with 4 Minutes. So she was always like one of those artists, so evergreen artists, I would have said, with Madonna.
Yeah, she's almost, I know this term gets bandied around. She's Lady Gaga before Lady Gaga, constantly reinventing herself, constantly surprising you You know, who would have thought that the lady who sung Like a Virgin and Holiday is the same artist as Hung Up? Or,
Oh
you
yeah,
know, or Express Yourself. Like, they're all
yeah.
such different records.
It's sort of like a progression of time. It's sort of like with a progression of someone's sort of time. I don't know if there's, I think I've come across an artist which is sort of like, I think you were talking with Haley about it, Taylor Swift, like the teenage sort of artist, teenage and then sort of late adolescence into adulthood. And we get to, with Madonna, we get into adulthood with these ballads in 1998. And to then at a certain age, it's throwing back to a bygone era. Like when we get older, we look back on these sort of bygone eras and we attach to those bygone eras. For example, a lot of people in this podcast are fans of the music from the 1990s. And an interesting thing, we do talk a lot about Five, A1, and all those pop acts who I felt were massive in 98, 99, 2000. But I felt that era, even though we had the Sugar Babes and Westlife, but I think the height of that era of the, there was a lot of girl groups, but I think the height of the, I don't remember them being many boy bands. And the closest thing that comes to boy band, this band, sadly for someone who has been on this podcast before, because I listened to that podcast and I thought it was really good, they split up and this were a big sort of boy band, but they were sort of a pop guitar group. And they kind of, you could say, started the explosion of rock music in the mid 2000s, were Busted. And then the other one was McFly, but they were still felt completely different to A1 or Five. And it's only really until 2011 we got into the mode where the boy bands were coming back. Well, we had Take That coming back, but they sort of modeled their music. For me, when I heard Patience for the first time, I felt it sounded, this is what I felt at the age of 14. It felt for me as it sounded like something from Snow Patrol. But obviously that sort of boy band sort of thing, for boy bands like Take That in their earlier days or A1 or Five, we only really got that a few years later into the next decade with One Direction and The Wanted and obviously JLS and all that. But I feel like the boy band sort of days, I think if you grew with the boy bands in the late 90s and early noughties, I think the progression from that would have been onto, for me, the domineering bands were these guitar bands. And in our house was a lot of guitar music around and stuff like that. It was sort of like the transitional period, but a lot of these guitar bands were already established, like Stereophonics. They started out in 97. They had a brilliant album in 1999, Just Enough Education performed just before 2005. And they were sort of like Dakota, which I think was their first ever number one. They were still a bit. So it was a lot of like, of the new bands, there was always a place for the establishment. Stereophonics were now part of it. And obviously Oasis as well. And another thing, Blur sort of stopped all stuff in by the end of the 90s, but in 2000 they started. Damon Albarn joined Gorillaz, and they sort of were pretty big as well. And a lot of I remember they had like De La Soul in their do material with them with Feel Good Inc. And the number one, which was Dare, had Shawn Ryder. So basically, the establishment was doing what they were doing originally, or they were moving on and reinventing themselves and regenerating as under a new guise, like Damon Albarn was, and then Shawn Ryder.
Wasn't it that Shawn Ryder, it's called Dare because he couldn't say there?
I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, I want to say that is a thing, but in some ways, I listened to that song today. It makes no sense, doesn't it? It's Dare. It's a dare. It's the dare. Like,
oh yeah,
like it's Dare. It makes no sense, but Gorillaz had a lot of great songs.
Oh
in that era. You mentioned Feel Good Inc., which was in loads of soundtracks, and of course, a few years earlier, one of their first singles, Clint Eastwood, which has about 1 million mixes. It never sounds right to me. I never managed to find the one mix that I remember hearing because they just did so many of them, and it was it was a great novelty to have almost like a cartoon band. It really stood out, and I guess what we're seeing here, and I guess the repeated pattern is everything's a lot more visual, because we've already talked about Amarillo and how that video propelled the song that was 30 years old by that point, over 30 years old, to the number one spot and into the psyche of millions and World Cup songs. We're talking about a cartoon band.
I went to university around 2010 to 2014, but a lot of the music I was actually listening to was from 2005. So around 2012, I was still mentally, I was still in 2005 or 2006. I was still in that position with, I'd upgraded my MP3 player to a Creative Zen, but I still bought CDs. But I just still kept the music from 2005, such as X and Y from Coldplay. And like, I've been thinking about one of the songs recently, was called Talk, which was a sample of Kraftwerk's Computer Love, which is a favorite of mine from Kraftwerk. And just like thinking about the back of the lyrics, sort of like, just like getting that sort of nice sort of feeling, thinking about things. You can take a picture of something you see, you can climb a ladder up to your sun. So those still lyrics resonate for me 6 years later, basically 7 years later, as I say, in the middle of 2012. So I still was listening to that sort of music, but also because I was still sort of in that, and I was looking on the internet at like the songs, a lot of songs and hits from that year. And I noticed that Depeche Mode and a-ha were doing new music at the time as well. So there was loads of 80s bands still in the presence. So I had all that. And obviously a lot of the music we say was all brand new, but doing my research, it was sort of like a bit of a circle in a way. Like Britpop, they say, was actually influenced by the 60s. This was kind of influenced a lot by the 70s and the early 80s. Like Coldplay was sampling Kraftwerk in the same vein that Madonna was doing with ABBA. But a lot of these bands modelled themselves. Like there was a band called the Ordinary Boys, which were basically very similar to Madness in a way. So there was nothing particularly brand spanking new. In a way, like music today is either influenced by 90s dance music or 90s garage or 80s pop.
Even the number one that Elton John and Tupac had in that year was an old Tupac recording mixed with an old Elton John recording. And that record, you say there about listening to 2005 long after the year has ended. I'm kind of the same. There was a point around 2011, maybe to 2014, where the years between 2004 to 7 were like, you'd constantly be revisiting, because you go into 2007, you've got the beginning of the new Take That, you've got Mika, all of the stuff that comes out of there, this really interesting thing. And obviously in the mid 2000s, we've not mentioned Scissor Sisters yet, who were massive at
they were on the
time.
FIFA soundtrack for the FIFA 2005 game. So obviously Jamiroquai were back in, they were popular in the 90s, but they were doing, so it was it's just like an eclectic mix, and nothing was particularly brand new, but it felt new at the same time, because a lot of these, like they say, like there was a band called The Editors, for me, remind me a lot of Joy Division, especially songs like Munich and all that. So a lot of these sort of bands, there are sort of like harps back to probably sort of the late 70s and early 80s with that, because things go round in a circle, just like Oasis took a lot of influence from the Beatles or John Lennon and all that. So just things just go round in sort of circles, but it still fits in my theory with, I've came up with my sort of theory with rock music, because in 2016, I was moving away from the 2005 sort of stance and getting sort of like properly discovering Blur and Oasis, which was coincided with 20 years of the sort of height of the Britpop era, when we had all sorts of things on the TV, and obviously loads of events around Britain socio-politically were sort of coinciding with that. And I sort of came up that with rock music, that this sort of wave of the noughties fits in from a progression that we had from Britpop to post Britpop. So that's sort of Travis and Stereophonics. And then it sort of evolves. We've got Coldplay. Then we're getting into, even though we had sort of it's been mentioned that it's sort of like been another bit of a reaction from Busted and McFly, even though they're not really. The fact is, everyone sort of picked up a guitar and did music in 2005 and 2006. We've got this sort of wave, and now we've got into the indie pop sort of wave. So it sort of starts from the 60s. So we've got like the Beatles and all those sort of British bands. Then we have glam rock, then we have punk, then we have new wave, and then we have Manchester. Then that evolved into Manchester and Baggy, that evolved into Britpop. And they all sort of came through reactions. But I'm not sure like Arctic Monkeys had number one because of Busted and McFly. They were just boy bands, but they acted a bit more like these bands, which I have in high esteem and make up most of my 2005 playlist that I'd carried on up until 2012, because that's the point I really remember being immersed in that particular year throughout that summer and into the autumn. It's sort of, it's probably sort of more sort of an evolution from that. I might have lost my words a little bit because I might have got sidetracked from all that, but it's sort of, but the way you could sort of see it is like getting to a certain age, you might have been into Busted and then might have like progressed to like, I'm a bit older now, I like the Arctic Monkeys. So it's sort of all that. But I remember you saying that in 2006, it was the great guitar explosion and everyone had sort of put their simps away, barring maybe Coldplay and Block Party.
Yeah, it did seem that way. But I can't say I was entirely focused in 2006. I started college that year, and I think I was a little bit distracted. And obviously, there was so much music around from The Killers and Razorlight and things like that. I remember seeing Razorlight at Live 8 on the TV and being utterly blown away. Like, I've never seen these guys before, and they, they came out with things like America. And it's, where I'd been listening to a lot of 70s and maybe 80s music by that point, you almost have moments where you're like, I'm somehow dialed into the current psyche of what's going on. Suddenly this speaks to me. And there were a lot of tracks around that period that certainly did that. We could talk about this for hours. I think this.
Of course, yeah.
This is about 12 podcasts, I think. For this particular subject, Tim, give us maybe one track and one album from that year that you want to highlight.
I would probably say, I've mentioned this before, the album that I bought that year was Employment by the Kaiser Chiefs. And I've got to say, it never had any commercial success. Everyone thinks if I predict right and every day I love you less and less. But I'd say You Can Have It All. Even though it was used on the promo for BBC One's Inside Out, which was the regional program, which went out on the Monday evening in 2005. So I'd probably say that's what gives me that fuzzy feeling, because when I listen to music, I just want that nice fuzzy feeling, and I get that with a lot of tracks from this era, basically.
Excellent. I'm gonna go for, I think, the album, just because it's I've just seen it written there, and I'm gonna say this, G4 by G4. If you remember, they were that operatic group who went on the X Factor.
Them, yeah.
And they just happen to be from where I am right now, Bognor Regis. So just give them a little shout out. I think certainly that they're celebrities around here. And their version of Bohemian Rhapsody was just sublime. Let's draw this to an end. Thanks, Tim, for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.